We are only slightly behind schedule, but we are going to get started. So it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Bruce Wingus, the editor of the Akron Beacon Journal, who will be moderating the next session on fake news and the 2016 election.
That's pretty neat. You just show up and get applause. I like that. First of all, I need to do some housekeeping. Let me close the door. For those of you keeping score at home, you'll notice that we have nobody up here named Sophia. Sophia McLennan from Penn State was scheduled to be on the panel, but she was taken ill. So we found not one substitute panelist, but two as of yesterday. We've got, please welcome Michael Scherer. He's the regional editor for Gatehouse Media in Ohio. Welcome, Michael. And Dr. Ryan Clausen, Kent State political science professor. Thank you both for joining us on such short notice here. To get us started, I'm just going to share a couple of stories, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists to talk. Let me start with this guy in Maryland named Carmen Harris. He listens to then-candidate Donald Trump speaking in Columbus, Ohio, about elections being rigged. So Harris decides to write a fake story so he can make some real money. He has this website called ChristianTimesNewspapers.com. So he puts this headline on his website. It says, "Breaking, tens of thousands of fraudulent Clinton votes found in Ohio warehouse." And he puts a picture on there, and he puts some names in there and stuff like that. The clicks that were generated by that story made this guy money to the tune of about $1,000 an hour for a while through ad revenue. Ohio Secretary of State John Husted and Franklin County Board of Elections exposed the story to be false, but by the time that happened, it had already been shared by 6 million times. Two footnotes to this story. In the fall of 2016, the website that the guy Harris had was valued at $125,000. He decided to hold on and see if he could get some more money. That didn't work out well for him because Google decided to pull its ads from fake news sites, including his, so after that it was worthless. He didn't get any money for that. And then Harris was interviewed by the New York Times this past January, and after that story came out, he was fired from his job as a legislative aide to a Maryland Republican lawmaker. So I love a story with a happy ending there. A couple other things to share. Russia used 470 fake accounts to buy $100,000 worth of ads on Facebook promoting divisive social and political messages to Americans during this past election cycle. According to the Daily Beast, these propaganda posts were seen by a minimum of 23 million people and may have reached as many as 70 million people. Just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times reported that an army of fake Americans were created by Russia on Twitter and Facebook to help fuel anger in our polarized country. So they not only made up stories, but they made up people. Amid all this, we have a president who freely labels as fake news that which he deems untrue. We heard taunts of fake news shouted at journalists who were covering the election, and those taunts continue today. And I'll leave you with a couple other thoughts here. Richard Cohen of the Washington Post wrote, I just love this quote, "When we agree, it's the truth. When we disagree, it's fake news." Don't know if fake news can be reduced to one sentence, but it's in our culture. It's going to be here, and so we got to deal with it. So what do we learn from 2016 as voters in general and journalists in particular? That's what our panel's here to talk about. And so I'd like to start by having each of our panelists introduce himself and herself and just give us a quick definition of fake news. We'll start with you, Indira.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm just thrilled to be here, and it's such great questions. So I'm looking forward to hearing yours for all of us. I'm Indira Lakshmanan. I am the Newmark Chair in Journalism Ethics at the Poynter Institute, as Kelly said, and I am also a columnist for the Boston Globe and spent the last 10 years in Washington covering politics and foreign policy, working mostly for Bloomberg, and before that I spent more than a dozen years overseas as a foreign correspondent, mostly for the Boston Globe, and also work in TV and radio as well.
And can you give me a definition of fake news?
Oh, my definition of fake news? I have a slide for that. So it's the first slide, which our friend will put up for us, and I love this. This is from Arizona State University. And I love their little matrix that they've made because it sort of puts in a really easy to understand way the points that I think Kelly was making earlier about how fake news can be anything from an intentional hoax where you're either just trying to make money for sneakers like the Macedonian teens who we heard about, not necessarily a political motivation, to I would say groups like InfoWars, where I think they must knowingly know that the information is not right, that, that in fact Sandy Hook, the massacre, was not fake, but their political motivations, all the way over to The Onion. And I will say, I know Kelly mentioned The Onion about how, that gets retweeted and then it becomes fake news when it's actually meant to be humor. I spent 7 years as a foreign correspondent based in China, and Chinese state-run news organizations routinely picked up stories from The Onion and wrote them up in the People's Daily and China Daily. I feel believing they were true. I don't think they were trying to mock America so much as, maybe this goes back to confirmation bias, saw crazy stories and thought, oh my goodness, isn't America crazy? And then they'd write it up, and we would always, face palm and say, oh my God, it's The Onion again, appearing on the front pages of China's newspapers. I think that the editors have gotten more savvy to that now, but certainly in the late 90s and early 2000s, The Onion routinely appeared in Chinese media. So, fake news.
Great.
So I'm Gregory Cordy. I am a White House correspondent for USA Today. And I also am from Ohio. I have worked at newspapers in Lorain, Ohio. I worked for the Akron Beacon Journal, for Mizell, and for Jan. I went on to the Cincinnati Enquirer, and then to USA Today. I'm a proud graduate of Ohio University, and I know we have another Bobcat here on the panel. I said this last time I was here, and I'll say it again, I mean it in all sincerity. It's really great to be here at Kent State, which is widely regarded as the second best journalism school in the state. A little bit of, sibling rivalry. The MAC is back. I am very cognizant in my job every day that fake news in the context of the environment that I work in is an epithet used by the President of the United States to discredit reporting that he does not like. And I brought a whole presentation full of Trump tweets. I'm not going to go through them because we've already been through enough, and probably you've already seen enough to last you a lifetime. But my definition of fake news then, and this is something, it's somewhat humorous, and I got this from Craig Gilbert, who is the Washington bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and he said this at the Gridiron Dinner, which is a sort of humorous sort of event every year of journalists and newsmakers. And he said, everybody's talking about fake news these days, but it can get a bit confusing because they're not always talking about the same thing. For example, there's genuine fake news, which is actual fake news made up by actual fake journalists. And then there's fake news, which is when people who don't like real news call it fake news. And then I would add that it gets even more confusing because within that fake news, there is real news that's actually fake, done by real reporters, that is inaccurate, has a problem, that the president will then seize on and say, well, see, that problem's not true. The first ever Trump fake news tweet, which somebody showed before, was him pushing back on a report on CNN that he was going to go on, continue to have a role on The Apprentice as president. He called it fake news. Well, so far, we have not seen him have a role in the production of that turned out to be actual, real, fake news. Did I say that right?
I would say that's real news that was a mistake, and probably a correction was run.
But
that wasn't intentionally fake, right?
And here's the discussion that I think we need to have. Because a lot of people don't make that distinction, right? And this is, I think, a family conversation we have to have within journalism, that if you are using an anonymous source to say, and that's what this story was, an anonymously sourced story that says that President Trump will remain on The Apprentice as president, and that turns out not to be true, where's the accountability?
Right.
Right?
I've been writing about this. It needs to be corrected, and it needs to be publicly said.
And so that is actually one distinction between real fake news and fake news, is that real journalists correct themselves when they're wrong. And real fake news, You understand what I'm saying. And so, yeah, so that's my very confusing definition of fake news for now.
Ryan, can you bring us some clarity, please?
I'll try to. So I'm Ryan Clausen, and I'm a professor of political science here at Kent State University, and I conduct research on participating in elections, how people vote, why they vote, who they vote for. And I've also done quite a bit of public opinion research on the sort of capacity of Americans to do their due diligence as democratic citizens. And so I think that's maybe where my research agenda dovetails with the topic for this conference. So I think as an academic, I would favor a more narrow rather than a broader definition, because it gets harder and harder to pin it down the broader the definition gets. And so while it's certainly the case that it's an interesting phenomenon when a sitting president can discredit real news organizations by painting them with a fake news brush, I think that for me the more narrow definition of it's when it's it's news that is incorrect, that was distributed with the intent to deceive by fake news organizations.
Okay, Michael.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here. My name is Michael Shear. I'm the regional editor for Gatehouse Media here in Northeast Ohio. I'm actually based here in Kent. Have been working here since April, and thrilled to be working with Kent State University and be here today to talk about this important topic. I also bring a perspective I think it might be a little different in the sense that in the past year I've been associated, I worked for Gannett for the past 17 years and oversaw newsrooms in 10 Ohio communities as close as Mansfield to here and so on, and have had a good opportunity to understand how a lot of voters in what you may consider Trump territory based on election results, how they perceive the media and how they view what we do every day. As far as the definition of fake news, it's everything from, everything that's been described here is obviously accurate in that sense, but it's, at its worst, it is when people take accurate, factual news and label it as false or fake news because they don't agree with it. And that is a significant issue that I think is probably at the crux of what we really need to talk about here today. But it can be anything, even, I think the kind of the campaign commercials that you all see every day out there during election season, they contribute to all this too. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and it does carry a lot of weight with people. So I think any piece of information out there that is not accurate or misleading or spun for a certain purpose falls into some classification of fake news, although I realize that risks expanding the definition pretty wide. But it's also, these are real life, and probably the oddest example of fake news I've had is a few years ago, we had someone take an old article off our website when Trick or Treat was canceled 1 year, 2 years before, and recycled it on Facebook as Trick or Treat's been canceled for tonight. And we had a heck of a time getting that story squashed down because it was on an old content management system. We couldn't get it removed. So anything like that, people believe what they see, and that story, we found out about it because on Chartbeat, our #1 story suddenly was Trick or Treat's canceled. I walked in the newsroom, what happened? Well, it's not canceled. So people believe what they see, and that is the real root of the problem, I think. And in that case, it was a beautiful sunny day. They had no reason to believe it, and they still did, at least to click on it. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start with a question for Greg. Can you give us some examples of Trump fake news tweets and talk about how they played out in the political ecosystem?
Yeah, so as I said before, this whole, the first Trump complaint of fake news came last December. And remember, this whole conversation we're having about fake news was a term that nobody, or at least I didn't use, and I think most people had never heard of this sort of fake news phenomenon until it was after the election, and people looking back in retrospect saying, whoa, what just happened? Trying to explain this weird confluence of factors that got Trump elected. So in the aftermath of that election, immediate questions about the legitimacy of Trump's win, whether it was influenced by a foreign power, whether to what extent fake news had anything to do with it, to what extent the media might have played a role in overstating the importance of the Clinton email scandal. And so in that environment, Trump, feeling like the media is somehow understating his election victory, which was a surprise, I think, to most people in the sort of political and journalistic classes that in Washington, began to push back, and he co-opted this term of fake news to say, no, you're fake news. And he's done it in, I went and I checked the other day, there have been 110 tweets complaining about fake news from the president. He's brought it up in 18 different speeches, remarks, and press conferences. Sometimes it's it's directed at, all the fake, what used to be called the mainstream media, or what Sarah Palin called the lamestream media, is now the fake news media in Trump parlance. Sometimes it's directed at a very specific reporter, and his favorite target is Jim Acosta of CNN. He has shut down entire press conferences or press availabilities by saying, you're fake news, and walking out. In tweets, he'll say, why won't the fake news media cover this good news story? My favorite is, why won't the fake news media cover that the Dow reached an all-time high? That's a story that's literally in every newspaper in the country. Every newspaper in the country, every day, covers, where the Dow is. But he didn't get credit for it, so the fake news. And then, we have the example of him on The Apprentice. Another example is the reverse of that is something that he complains about that's fake news that later turns out to be true. He complained that it was fake news, this conversation that he had early on in his presidency with the Prime Minister of Australia, which did not go well. Let's just leave it there. He said it was fake news. The transcript, the entire transcript of that conversation was leaked, and the original reporting on that phone call turned out to be 100% accurate. So there's an example, we were talking before, where sometimes anonymous sources can lead you astray. Sometimes the anonymous sources turn out to be 100% correct. But to Trump, it's all fake news. So yeah, that's something that we just sort of live with, an epithet again that we live with every day. I don't know what to do about it. I think people expect me to take it personally, and I don't. We've talked about this new Google project, this Report for America that was announced this week. In the Poynter story on that there was
Heck of a program.
Yeah, we have a problem with autoplay videos. Yeah, so we have autoplay on our videos, and it's very controversial. Mizell, would you like to address that as the Vice President of News Operations? But there was a quote in this Poynter story that said, part of the problem, and one of the reasons why we need to groom more local journalists is because too many political reporters today have never had the experience of being lied to at a local level. And so when they reach the national level, they think that it's a novel idea that politicians lie. When in fact, every politician I've ever covered, down from the local school board, to city council, to state legislature, to Congress, to the President of the United States, engages in some form of dissembling, shading the truth, spinning, selective facts. It's only in their interest, right? They want to tell a story. They are selling a product. The product is themselves, and it is not in their interest to give you countervailing information about how their policies aren't working. And it's our job as journalists to flush that out. And that, we've now reached this environment where those same politicians can push back. They have direct access to forms of communication like Twitter or Facebook or whatever else to give their own narrative without the filter of the press. And so you have President Trump, when this came up earlier in the summer, these continuing questions about his use of social media. Mizell, my Vice President of News Operations, who's 3 or 4 steps up the Gannett hierarchy than I am, thinks that we shouldn't cover Trump tweets. I'm still covering Trump tweets because they are messages from the President of the United States They are presidential statements. They're not always worded as we expect presidents to behave, but as President Trump said, it is modern-day presidential. And so that's the environment that we're in.
May I say something about
Sure,
the Trump
have at it.
I have sort of come along a continuum of my feeling about the Trump tweets. When Trump was when he was running for president, I was really disturbed by how much coverage all of his tweets got. And tweets were about all sorts of things, including his business. And that continues to be the case when he, as president, tweets about going to his golf clubs, his various golf clubs. And I think there are all sorts of ethical problems with that. But I happen to have come to the point of agreeing with Greg that we do need to cover his tweets because he is the president. And if he's not going to come out and give a press conference, or even if he does, the things he says on Twitter are automatically they're official statements of the U.S. government, of the White House. We have to cover them. And you know, as much as we're shocked and all of us are up at 5 o'clock in the morning to see what he's tweeting, you know, and every news organization that has a White House team has someone whose job it is to be awake early in the morning to make sure they don't miss the Trump tweet. You also have to cover everything else that's going on. You have to cover the quiet changes that are happening at the Department of Interior. You have to cover the changes that are happening, you know, to try to bring down the Affordable Care Act. You have to cover everything. And the answer to that is more journalists. And it's not easy in a time when newsrooms have shrunk because the whole business model has collapsed. That's a whole other conference we could have. But I do think that even when resources are scarce, you have to make sure, yes, there's somebody covering the tweets, but there's also somebody sort of pulling the curtain and looking behind it and trying to figure out, while all this bombast is happening, what is really changing. And there are some news organizations that are doing a very good job of keeping an eye on that as well. I would say that Washington Post is one of those. And so that's just my point about tweets. Cover those, but don't forget to cover everything else.
And I don't think there's anybody in any newsroom in Washington that would disagree with that we have to do both.
Yeah.
Indira, since you were talking about the White House, and you've had experience in Washington, and you're an experienced journalist, put yourself in the White House. Is it a winning strategy to be yelling fake news as much as the current administration does?
Look, I mean, this goes back to the baseline problem we have, which Mandy talked about, which is the pre-existing lack of trust in the mainstream media. You know, there are studies over time that show that this has always been a problem in the sense that people have always trusted their news sources. They don't necessarily trust the news writ large. And, but this has been declining historically since the 1970s when Gallup started looking at it. I have a couple of slides on this, on trust in the media. And, you know, what I find fascinating about this is that if you, right. So if we go to, there's one here that looks at, I can't read it very well. I hope you guys can read it better than I can. But, okay, so who do you trust more to tell the truth about important issues, President Trump or the news media? And I've put together several of these slides that show this is from 2016, and I've got several that come up through basically now, almost. And what's been interesting to me, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but Gallup in the 70s started asking people about public trust in institutions, including in the media. And for the last few decades, that public trust in the media has been declining to really precipitously low levels. However, in the last 1 year since the election, it has been edging back up again, which I find comforting. I think they're, you know, in the same way that major news organizations have talked about their subscriptions going up in the last year, you've seen a resurgence somewhat. It's crawling from a very low level, but you've seen some increase in trust in media over the last year. It is very disconnected in the sense that Republicans are much more likely to distrust the media than Democrats. And, you know, so that also affects the numbers. And you see that throughout these studies. But what I was going to say is if you have the underlying problem of distrust in the media, then it is a winning strategy, if you're in the White House, to rebrand what the word fake news means. And I think that it was quite brilliant, you might say diabolical, but brilliant of President Trump to see that in the aftermath of his win in November, that people were trying to make it out that he won because of fake news, because of what I referred to earlier, the 20 headlines. I mean, the fake news headlines that outpaced the real news headlines. And I do have a slide on that here, if we are able to find that. It's the one about the sharing of that. Maybe we can find that. But anyway, that to me means that Trump essentially figured out, if people are going to say that I only won because of fake news, well, I'm going to denounce the very people who are saying that that is fake news. And I think it was quite brilliant, because it plays into, again, the people who don't want to believe us, that co-opts the term and gives them a way to, turn the term against us, to weaponize the term fake news. I also think one problem with the term fake news to begin with is it's not really news. I mean, it's hoaxes. So maybe we should have called it something else in the first place. I mean, the term has stuck, which is kind of unfortunate, and I think we sort of have to hang on to what its true meaning is meant to be and not allow it to be co-opted. Pizzagate is one example of this. People have mentioned this. Mizell referred to it, and Kelly referred to it. Pizzagate is one of the things that really made me feel incredibly passionate about this problem of fake news, because that pizza parlor, Comet Ping Pong in Washington, D.C., if you don't know the story is that essentially James Alefantis, who's the owner of this pizza parlor in my old neighborhood in DC, where I lived until 2 months ago. This was my local pizza parlor, literally a couple blocks from my house. It's where I went with my kids. It's the pizza parlor that did little fundraisers for my kids' public school. It's a great little community pizza parlor. And in the hacking and in the WikiLeaks releases of emails, including those of John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, one of the things that surfaced, there were just really benign emails, including I think it was his lasagna recipe that he got from his daughter. One of the things was a back and forth that he had with James Alefantis about having a little fundraiser in the neighborhood at this pizza parlor. So people, anti-Hillary Clinton forces on the internet, seized on these and changed that into, okay, here's a guy who runs a pizza parlor that is helping Clinton with a small neighborhood fundraiser, so let me turn that into, this must be a pizza parlor where there is pedophilia going on in the basement and a dangerous sex ring, forced sexual slavery of children, and it's all being directed by Hillary Clinton and John Podesta. It sounds completely crazy, because it is, and first of all, there's not even a basement in this pizza parlor. So that's, one thing that's kind of the tip-off. But it got out there, starting from channels such as 4chan that Mandy has highlighted, and then got into the whole ecosystem through InfoWars, Alex Jones's notorious media conglomerate, and got out there into the public. And it was so upsetting to me, because as soon as I saw that story getting traction, I said to my husband, mark my words, someone is going to come here with a gun and something terrible is going to happen at our pizza parlor. And indeed, it was a Sunday, and we were on our way to the pizza parlor, and we got stopped by a police barricade at the edge of the block, with the police saying, there's a gunman, turn around, you can't be here. And a guy came and he fired a few shots into the ground. Thankfully, nobody was hurt or killed, but he had to even admit himself, gee, I went around and checked all the doors and there are no children being held hostage. So this to me is an example of how the actual problem of hoax stories can cost lives. I mean, thankfully it wasn't fatal to anybody, but a long way of saying that I think, we get away from the original meaning of what fake news is, but I think that for the White House, certainly for their supporters, it's been a really good strategy for them to rebrand and co-opt the term fake news. It becomes a cudgel to beat us with, and we have to just do better and become more trustworthy, and that's a sort of long-term project, as Mandy was saying.
A question for Michael over there. You've written that newspapers such as yours operate with no political allegiance, although we're constantly accused of being liberal or conservative, occasionally in back-to-back phone calls. How has the concept of fake news played out with this question of political allegiance and how you answer your phone calls? Is it better, worse, or what?
It's worse. There's no doubt about that. Actually, my boss had a phone call a few weeks ago that was quite interesting, and it was from a subscriber who had received a bill and had decided that before he was going to pay his bill, he wanted to find out whether this particular paper of ours was a conservative newspaper or not. And so thankfully, my boss very skillfully answered the call with, well, sir, how do you lean? What are your political convictions and beliefs? And over the course of the conversation, the gentleman, it was a very polite conversation, I should stress, clearly was a conservative, had a conservative viewpoint. And so then the answer became, well, sir, you're probably going to view us as a liberal newspaper. Because I think anything that we're trying to be nonpartisan down the middle as much as humanly possible, and as such, that's going to be more left than where you are. And so the conversation ended cordially and all that. But I don't know if the guy subscribed or paid his bill again or not. But there's a very real issue there for all media that rely on paid subscribers that we're being judged in a more harsh light than we ever have been before. So. I think that conversation, as it was related back to me, inspired the column that you quoted there. And I think the big issue here for people is that we don't always understand each other very well. And if you could be talking to the most middle, moderate person in the world who sometimes votes left, sometimes votes Republican or Democrat, whatever it may be, and they'll be more conservative or liberal than you are, and you may brand them as a liberal or conservative when they're moderate. So I think that lack of understanding among the populace, as we talk about lack of understanding what's being said or the conversations that are out there, it can be really a challenging situation. The other thing is we're getting scrutinized a lot more heavily. Any bold column that I run from a left or right perspective, I tend to get a phone call or two about it or an email. And a few weeks ago, we were actually accused of fake news here. And it was involved a wire story, but there were protests out in San Francisco one Sunday here recently that started out fairly peacefully, and one of our wire editors pulled a story, put it in the paper, and it basically ended up being fairly inaccurate because later in the evening, and I'm not sure if we did a good job updating the wire or not, but the story, the protest turned more violent and got out of hand a bit. And so when the story runs in the paper the next morning saying it was not violent, it was peaceful, versus what really happened, the time cycle caught up to us for print at least. And it was, you can understand why somebody who saw the protests that were more left-sided, I guess you might say, the left protesting, they viewed it as inaccurate. And the guy emailed me, and he was right to some extent in that what we published was not true in the end, but there was certainly no attempt by our journalists to mislead people or be inaccurate, just how the circumstances worked out. So I think the scrutiny that we're facing is very real, and that's healthy in some ways, but it's also very challenging in many more ways.
Okay. Question for Ryan. You're a political scientist. You study politics and behavior. How did fake news affect political engagement in 2016? Did it lead to a higher voter turnout of possibly misinformed voters, or how did that play out?
So I'll talk about turnout a little bit and then give a more general answer about how it might have impacted the election as well. But I think that it's hard to affect whether or not people vote, and so it seems unlikely to me that fake news had a big effect on whether or not people showed up at the polls. In the immediate aftermath of the election, we were trying to figure out whether turnout was higher or lower, and even that was a little bit difficult. Political scientists always turn to a political scientist by the name of Michael McDonald, and a lot of journalists do as well. CNN was reporting that McDonald's figure had the 2016 turnout as just off of 2012. And 2012 and 2008 were both really high turnout elections. The things that seem to affect whether or not people participate are things like whether it's a close race, whether it's an interesting race, whether it's hard fought.
Whether there's weather.
Whether there's weather, yeah. I mean, I suppose that on the lower end of things that can affect whether or not someone goes out to vote, rain, sometimes prevents some people from turning out. Cold weather. We could talk as a country about whether we need to have our elections on Tuesday during business hours in November's, but we give a lot of lip service to the idea that everybody should participate. We could make it a little easier for people, but So I don't think that fake news is probably the biggest explanation for where turnout ended up in 2016. And in general, I think, and it's probably the wrong thing to say at a meeting devoted to the topic of fake news, but I think it's a bit of a tempest in the teapot when it comes to understanding how voters made their decisions on Election Day. So there hasn't been a massive amount of academic research on this most recent iteration of incorrect information being, circulating in the American electorate that we are currently calling fake news. It takes academics a long time to figure out what they want to say about anything typically. But there has been one article published that at least I'm aware of that I heard about on WKSU on my way home one evening. So it was published recently in the Journal of Economic Perspectives by scholars at New York University and Stanford. And they did a really clever study on a couple of different dimensions to look at sort of the basic way in which fake news has been problematized. So we hear that lots of people get their news on social media. We hear that these fake news stories have been popular. We hear some people believe them, and we hear that there was a Trump bias in 2016 when it came to fake news. And so they sort of went through systematically and assessed each of those different points. So they found 156 sort of verifiable fake news stories that they were able to study. And there was a Trump bias in those. Of the 156, it was about 115 Trump, pro-Trump, versus about 41 pro-Hillary. So it's not entirely one-sided, but there was certainly a major bias in terms of that distribution. In terms of how popular these things are, sort of at the upper end of the estimates, we hear people say that maybe on average Americans saw about 3 of them. And that's based on tens of millions of shares and hundreds of millions of clicks. But even that number, it's not a uniform distribution, so tons of people didn't see any of them. And there's a few people that saw just about all of them and clicked on it a whole bunch of times and shared it a whole bunch of times. And of course, there's a lot of overlap in social networks. So even the average of 3 per person isn't a very accurate way of thinking about how each person in the electorate experienced this. One of the things that they did in this study was they surveyed 1,200 people and had a bunch of fake news stories and asked them if they had seen these fake news stories. And about 15% of this sample of 1,200 that was supposed to be representative of the national electorate said that they had seen the fake news stories that were actually fake news stories. But the really clever thing that these researchers did, so that'd be a much lower, I think, number than saying that everybody saw 3 of them, right? So maybe only about 15% of people actually remember seeing and can recognize fake news. But the really clever thing that these researchers did was that they also included a placebo set of fake news stories. So these were fake news stories, right? So we'll trip over that, I'm sure. And about 14% of people said that they had seen the fake news stories. So if you subtract that placebo effect, the real exposure is maybe as low as 1% of people. And so I think that it's probably far lower in terms of how far into the American electorate these things penetrated than we might be inclined to believe. One of the last things that I'll talk about that they did, there's lots of neat things in this study, but one of the last things that they did was try to think a little bit about, well, let's say that maybe a revised figure would say that maybe about on average Americans saw 1 of these fake news stories. What kind of impact would that have? And so they turned to the political advertising literature, and of course political scientists have been trying to determine what kind of effects political advertising have for a long time, so there's a ton of research on that. The basic consensus is that one political ad in a national campaign like the presidential election affects the vote by about 0.02%. So if we think that seeing a fake news story had about as big of effect as seeing a political ad, it's still a very small impact.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about that. This is for all of y'all. Do you feel that fake news will have as much of effect on future elections as it had in 2016? Will we as voters learn to throw it aside, even if it's a small percentage, or will we embrace it because it backs up what we believe? Anybody?
Well, I will say, so they say in this study, there's just a ton of great stuff in this study, but they say that people are about 15% more likely to believe a story if it shares their partisan predisposition. One of the other things that they point out, and I think Indira's slide showed this as well, traditional media scores way higher on trust than stuff that people get from social media.
I think that, there are a number of initiatives underway to try to prevent fake news from having an effect not just on American elections, but on elections and democracy all over the world. And a first draft, which Kelly referred to, Claire Wardle's organization, is one of many groups that are working on this problem, for example, in Europe. And as the Storyful slides from Mandy pointed out, it was interesting how there was a concerted campaign to put fake news out before the French election. That's also true ahead of the German election. It was true ahead of elections earlier this year, also in Belgium. And what has been interesting is seeing how it is less the sort of soil. If you think about the seed and soil effect, the soil there is less fertile for taking on fake news and allowing it to grow because there is more trust for establishment media. And so these sort of wild sources that came out of the blue were less likely to grow in that soil. We have a problem with our soil here in the United States. Because there is such low trust, it just allows things to go wild. And this is a problem, we'll talk about it on a panel coming up about news literacy. And Damaso will talk about the idea that you need to sort of catch kids when they're young so that when those kids become voters at age 18 and beyond, that hopefully they're more skeptical of information that they see. They check it more. The people who are the adults now who are just retweeting, less on Twitter, Facebooking and sharing on Facebook information that they see simply because of the confirmation bias. It tells them what they want to say, what they want to believe. Hopefully those kids, if we're teaching them young, when they grow up, they won't be doing that. I will say Facebook has been involved, and they're working with the International Fact-Checking Network, which is housed at Poynter, and a number of other fact-checking organizations to try to flag content that has serious problems and that has been questioned as not being true. We need to know from Facebook much more about what effect this flagging is having. They have not given us the real they have not, they've told us it's effective, but they haven't shown us the underlying data to prove to us how much less is this information being shared once it's flagged. That's, one of the initiatives underway, but of course, I just want to say this, I think we all know that Facebook's business model depends on engagement. It depends on getting its people to come onto the platform and stay on the platform as long as possible. That's how the ads work, that's how everything about Facebook works. So the problem is, in a way, I don't know that anyone wants to say this out loud, but confirmation bias and filter bubbles, which Facebook publicly says they're very much against, in fact, work to their advantage. If I'm a Facebook user and everybody thinks like me and we're all re-Facebooking all the same things that fit into our worldview, I'm going to stay engaged on the platform longer. If I have friends or family or colleagues who think differently from me and they make me mad, then I'm more likely to get off the platform and not be engaged on Facebook. So I think it does address the business model question that how much is it in the interest of social media platforms? I'm asking this as a question. I'm not saying I have insider knowledge, but it certainly doesn't necessarily help them to break down filter bubbles and echo chambers. And that, of course, is bad for the overall health of our news and information ecosystem. But in Europe, I have been heartened to see that fake news has not spread as much. I want to say one thing about these academic studies, because there's so many good studies, like the one that Ryan's talking about. One thing that I found really interesting was a study that came out a couple months ago showing that fact-checking can actually, in some cases, change people's belief about a piece of information, that if you give them the fact check, they may say, okay, yeah, you're right. And the example that was given was Brexit, that voters who supported the Leave campaign were shown information saying, look, this, the statistics you're being shown by the Leave campaign are wrong. In fact, being in the EU is good for Britain's bottom line. It's economically better for the country. And some people looked at this and they said, okay, yeah, all right, I'll believe you that the statistics I've been quoting or seeing are wrong, but it's not going to change my vote. I'm still going to vote to leave. And the same thing was true of information related to Donald Trump. Donald Trump voters were shown information showing that information he was citing about immigrants or about refugees was wrong. It was false information. And they might say, okay, well, so that's wrong, but his overall point is right, and it's my worldview, or maybe he looks like my uncle, or I just feel good about him, or I just don't like Hillary, or whatever. It's not going to change my vote. So fact-checking can change people's view of whether a piece of information is right or wrong, but it doesn't necessarily change their behavior. And I think that's something we all really need to think about.
Gregory or Michael, anything?
I mean, I think the absolute key here is a couple things. One, as the part of the media, we have to be really good at what we're doing, and we can't afford any high-profile mistakes with stories or errors or anything that can legitimately be claimed as fake news. That's a significant challenge for us as media. And unfortunately, it only takes one agency at one place to help break that down a bit. To me, though, it's also, I'm hoping that what's happened the last few months here since the election, that the public is more aware of everything they see on Facebook or Twitter or everywhere is not necessarily true. I think there's, generally speaking, a greater awareness of that today than there was back during the campaign last year. And although the numbers Ryan cites are very reassuring in a lot of ways, that those stories may not have had a huge impact on the election, I think there's also just a tremendous, the national media is not trusted at the local level, and I think if you take this, I've not seen them, I probably should have looked to them, but if you take those national studies, if you looked at the rural Ohio voters, for example, and their trust of national media, the numbers would be even worse. And that's a significant problem that we need to keep working on. And it affects us daily, as I mentioned the Wire story earlier that we picked. And we still use AP stories for a significant part of our newspaper every day and our website. And so AP does a great job, in my opinion, but anything along those lines that's wrong or that's perceived as not pursuing Trump hard or the Democrats hard enough or whatever can be very challenging for us to deal with too. So I think hopefully people are more aware of what they're seeing. Hopefully that the subscription increases we're seeing at like the Washington Post, et cetera, and New York Times, hopefully that's going to help out, but we'll have to see where it goes.
Greg, anything to add?
No, I agree with everything. This point's been made before, but this fake news phenomenon didn't just pop up in 2016 out of a vacuum. It has its roots in distrust of the media that goes back, especially on the conservative side, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe longer. And so you have, that's where we're seeing a lot of the fake news sort of generate. It does have a pro-Trump bias to it because that is the audience that is most receptive to that message. How do we rebuild that trust? I mean, that's, I hope, part of the takeaway here today. I think it's going to come from journalists being better. I think it's going to come from news literacy. I think it's going to come, at least part of the solution is going to have to come from the public sector and public institutions. It's going to have to come from politicians willing to engage with the real media and come to some sort of mutually understood set of facts and not to intentionally sow cynicism in an attempt to undermine negative coverage. That's a tall order there, what I just said. I mean, and the problem is, in this politically polarized environment, it takes a lot of collective action from a lot of people, and all it takes is a very small minority to engage with this fake news, to share this fake news, to create a problem for the other maybe 99% of people who may not receive fake news, may not be receptive to it, may not believe it, but it's still something that is, as Mizell pointed out, taking up a good amount of journalistic resources.
I have one more question for the panelists, then we'll open up questions from y'all. Most of us in here publish news, verify facts, take that very seriously. Facebook and other social media do not. They say we're just a portal. Do you all see a day when social media such as Facebook and Twitter will take a more responsible role in the information they disseminate? Anybody?
I'll take a quick stab at that. They're absolutely a publisher, and for social media platforms to say we're not a publisher, it just makes no sense. I mean, the basis of it is not just people sharing recipes and saying what they had for lunch. As we know from, a Pew study, 60% of American adults said that Facebook was a primary source of their news consumption. Now, we can't know if that number is really true unless we have telemetry on people, that's actually monitoring their consumption of news and information, as AI specialists and computer scientists have said to me that we can't know whether that Pew number is true, but we can know that that's self-perception at the very least. 60% of Americans think they're getting their news primarily from Facebook. And I mean, I think that one problem that bothers me is the extent to which American news executives believe that they are powerless, and that, Facebook controls everything, so they have to play ball with Facebook. Facebook wouldn't have any content if they weren't using our content. I mean, that's my perspective. It would then just be simply recipes and pictures of people's dogs and kids. And so, they depend on us to have information that people are sharing on their site. And one thing that has bothered me for a long time is the extent to which, whether it's the New York Times or it's InfoWars or whatever, there wasn't a sort of easy way in one's feed to see the difference in the logo and the labeling. That has just recently changed. Just in the last few weeks, Facebook has made it so that you can see the logo and it's not all just the same blue stuff coming through, that anonymizes it and basically makes everything look the same. So then InfoWars is the same as the New York Times, which of course it's not, and that's ridiculous. So there has to be, whether it's through graphics, through branding, a clarity on what is the different information. But I also do, and this is a call to arms, I think news executives need to stand up, come together, and be counted and say, the way you use our material, we have to have more say in it. And you are a publisher, and you do have to be more responsible in the way that information is disseminated. That's how I feel.
I mean, as an editor, I guess I have kind of a love-hate relationship with Facebook in the sense that, getting our stories on Facebook and getting the exposure to drive readership is hugely important to us to try to grow online readership and audience. At the same time, it's very frustrating when you hear all these various problems with Facebook and the, how our news is often presented very similar to in the same manner as anyone else's random post about their party last night or a fake news story or whatever the case may be. So I think you're right, but I don't know how we get past not putting things on Facebook right now because it is where people are at and we have to reach people, and it's very challenging without social media to do so. I wish we didn't have to worry about that, but Facebook's like the number one thing we talk about every day practically in terms of how we're going to get our content exposed and read by people. So.
A couple things. One is, news organizations do have a role to play in this. There are a number of fake news sites that I've seen over the past year that use USA Today in part of its URL. It's something like usatoday.com.co. And when I see that, I let our social media managers know that, and they make efforts to make Facebook aware of it and also to take action against the infringement of our trademark. It's a never-ending battle. I found one just 2 nights ago. Somebody cyber squatting on Facebook at, their name was Official USA Today. And they're on, and I have to double check. I hope they've been taken down. One of the problems, though, here, and I've heard this a couple of times, is, we talked about France, we've talked about European elections, British elections. There's a difference. There are a number of differences. One is that under the Communications Decency Act, Facebook and Twitter are internet service providers that cannot be held responsible for what someone else does with their media. And that was a law written to address child pornography that now has a different implication in the era of fake news. The European Union has been much more aggressive about this. They have gone after Google and for using their monopoly power. They have passed a right to be forgotten law that says if you are mentioned in a news story, having done something stupid when you were a kid, and your name now comes up in a Google search result, you can ask Google to take that down. You don't have that protection in the United States. We have the First Amendment, and for better or for worse, and I happen to think it's mostly for better, but the First Amendment is now also being used as a weapon against itself. That because we have this near absolute freedom to speak, that means that fake news has just as much constitutional right as real news to say their piece. Now, do we need to give them a megaphone? Does Facebook need to have an algorithm that rewards that? Absolutely not. And that's a question for us as Facebook users and consumers. Facebook is selling a product, folks, and it's us, right? We are the product that Facebook is selling. And so it's up to us to insist on how we use these tools and how these tools are used on us. And that's going to have to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, I don't know if that I have a lot to add to all of those excellent points. I do think that all of the sort of prosecutorial interest in fake news here in the Mueller investigation, sort of alongside of the Russia collusion investigation, is the possibility that Russia was involved in fake news, and the FBI has weighed in on that earlier, of course. But then, Kenya, France, other places as well, that kind of institutional scrutiny might create some different rules going forward for social media that might help with this.
Michael, anything to add? Okay, let's open it up to you all. What can we answer from you? Got a couple of questions over here. Congratulations, you stumped our panel.
I bet that will come up in the PR panel that is going to be had this afternoon, and those people on that panel might be somewhat better equipped to answer a question like that, since we're all sort of politics specialists up here. But I'll just say, as a lifelong journalist, I always quail when I get things from PR people. Sorry, but I take everything I get from a PR person with lots of, with a whole shaker of salt. And just because I know what your job is, you have to promote. I mean, that's fine. I have a job and you have a job. It doesn't mean it has to be adversarial, but it means I'm not going to believe what you tell me. I need proof for that. So I don't really know where to go beyond that other than to say, I don't accept command messaging.
Yeah.
That's it.
I mean, I agree with that. Command messaging, I mean, if you're trying to get attention of the media, that's fine, that's your role, and we appreciate that. And there are many times it's helpful to us, depending what the message is and what the situation is. But I think, we're trying to focus our coverage on what our readers want to see and read and what's important in the community and all that. And your story may or may not fall into that category at any given time. And so, if a command message is ignored, that it may be the wrong day, it may be the wrong hour, it may be It may work 3 days later, who knows? Every day is different in our business, and where our priorities fall in any given moment can change quickly based on breaking news or what's happening at any given time. So, I think this develop relationships with journalists and talk to them about what you're trying to communicate. And yes, they will be skeptical, and they should be skeptical, but relationships are the best thing to make that work. As we were talking earlier about in the first panel about having relationships between journalists and readers, it's the same type of situation. So,
Question.
I have a question that is primarily.
Are the microphones on?
Testing. My question is primarily about the amplification of news stories, real, fake, deliberate, inadvertent, all of the above. It seems to me the most important thing isn't whether or not Alex Jones publishes something in InfoWars that is then picked up by Fox News or by the opinion people on Fox News. It's how many other sources, including Fox News and subsequent to Fox News, or maybe saying it slightly differently, if the Times prints a story, excellent reporting, that is amplified by NPR and by CBS, it's the amplification process that seems to me that really is where it starts to bite down. And I'm curious if you would comment on that. And also, related to that, is any news organization really doing an effective job of communicating across different tribes? If we live in our very own bubbles or whatever metaphor you want to use, what news organizations are doing a good job of being above that particular level and being able to communicate with within more than one bubble?
I think you raise a good point on your first question, and I'll even take it a step further. Because we're having this short-circuiting, right, where it used to be the media, the national media would be some sort of a gatekeeper to decide, what to sort the wheat from the chaff, the fact from the fiction before it gets reported. Now you have the President of the United States as someone who uses Twitter to disseminate information, but also uses alternative media to receive information. Mm-hmm. So when the President of the United States says something, how do we know whether he has that knowledge because he read the President's daily briefing from the intelligence community that morning, or whether he just saw it on Twitter? Donald Trump is a very avid consumer of all kinds of media. And so you could, I think this would be a great public service, if someone could annotate Trump's tweets by putting them side by side with a transcript of Fox and Friends. Because very often you'll see these tweets, and I'll be honest, sometimes I see them in the morning, it's my job, so I have Trump tweets, pushed as notifications to my phone, and I'll see them, and my first reaction is, well, here, and as we're talking here, here's 2 new Trump tweets. Spoke with Fox and Friends about Graham Cassidy. Well, these are retweets. But so that's a good question, and the problem is we are not the only gatekeepers. Now, the president's a gatekeeper, and again, going back to the disagreement that Mizell and I have, I believe that we still need to cover what the president says because he's the president saying it. And to answer your second question, I would respectfully, hold up USA Today as what we aspire to be at least, is the nation's newspaper, as the newspaper for the entire nation, not just, the coastal elites. Every other national newspaper is based in, the Wall Street Journal has an audience that's an elite audience. The New York Times is based in New York. The Washington Post is very much the paper of a company town, which is the government. USA Today is an outside the Beltway newspaper. That's just literally true because it's just out our headquarters at Tyson's Corner, Virginia. You can see the Beltway from Tyson's Corner. But we're an outside the Beltway, and we do have 109 other daily newspapers across the country that inform our reporting. And every analysis that I have seen that attempts to rank news media outlets from most conservative, most liberal, puts us pretty much dead on center. I am concerned that the center is not always the best place to be, because to a conservative, as the country becomes more polarized, to a conservative you are liberal, and to a liberal you are conservative. And that middle is shrinking. And we have fewer and fewer agreed upon facts that all of us can agree to. I hope we can get back to that. I hope that there's still a role for nonpartisan, objective, independent media in this country, but the technology and the proliferation of other sources of information is undermining that.
May I add one thought to that? One thing that I have found fascinating is, this whole idea of we have this culture in the United States, at least in my lifetime, of being nonpartisan, that we're all, those of us who came up in traditional newsrooms. I started my career at NPR on the foreign desk, and then, learned the trade as a Metro reporter, as a school board reporter at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and a police reporter at the Boston Globe. And I remember being indoctrinated wonderfully by my Metro editors about what to believe, what not to. Basically about being skeptical and checking everything, like check it and then check it again and then check it a third time, and and also about impartiality and not trying to show bias. That has changed dramatically in what is the news environment now. It's and so much of that is technologically driven by the advent of the internet, which didn't exist when I started as a reporter, and just the fact that anybody can make a blog, the rise of hyperpartisan news sites. If you're interested in this, I would highly recommend the work of Craig Silverman of BuzzFeed, who's done some fascinating, really in-depth reporting with other folks at BuzzFeed about the rise of hyperpartisan media online and how it has shifted the media landscape. Drudge is just one early example of that. We all know about Breitbart now, but the examples are legion, and they exist both on the left and the right. I look back at that Gallup study that began, which I keep referring to, that began in the 70s, looking at trust in the media, and I honestly believe that in some ways, and I wish I could pair up with an academic and do some research to try to prove this, but I believe that the fact that we've been falling ever since the 70s in the minds of the American public in terms of trustworthiness is partly because of the changes in the FCC, the deregulation due to Ronald Reagan that allowed for the rise of talk radio and cable news, and Fox News in particular, and Rush Limbaugh. And it allowed, the idea was, if we no longer had to have the Fairness Act in quite the same way that we had in television and up until through the 1970s and into the early part of the 80s, if you didn't have to show every point of view because there were going to be so many points of view. Not to quote Mao Zedong here, but the notion was letting 1,000 flowers bloom, right? If everybody's going to be out there with their own opinion, then you don't have to give left, right, and center in any one presentation. I think that what we saw about trust in media in the 1970s might have been an historical blip. Hear me out here. I think it might have been a high point because it was the era of the popularity of the evening news. And everyone sat down in their living room and they were watching Walter Cronkite. They were watching either ABC, CBS, or NBC. That's it. Or PBS, maybe. But the NewsHour didn't exist yet back then in the 70s. So I think everybody was getting their news from the same sources. And it was easier to trust that person who came into your living room because there were only 3 guys coming into your living room, and everybody was getting the same information. I think the changes that have happened, plus it was the post-Watergate, post-Vietnam War era, when I think people were more willing to believe establishment media because they saw establishment media as having proven what was wrong with the Vietnam War, proven what was happening in Watergate. So I think that was a high point. And I think ever since then, our trust in people's eyes has been declining, partly, as I say, because of changes in technology, rise of cable news, rise of talk radio, rise of the internet. But I think that in some ways, maybe, this is my theory, maybe Ryan and I should team up and do some research on this. But my theory is that perhaps in the past, you know, there was partisan media in the United States. I mean, I'm sure many of you have studied it in your classes. In the 1800s, you know, any town had a labor paper, it had a conservative paper, you know, there were different papers that represented different points of view. And that's where I think that people have traditionally believed their own newspaper that adheres to their worldview, and they haven't believed the others. So I do think maybe the 50s to the 70s was an irregular period of high trust in media because people were seeing one regulated thing. I feel like Connie wants to jump in here, but that's my theory. And so maybe we're in a situation where we can try to, and we should be trying to rebuild public trust, but I also think there are a number of other factors that have made trust in establishment media fall by the wayside. Let's face it, the New York Times is a different paper in the sense that it tries to be down the middle than its predecessor was 50 years ago.
I just want to say, especially for the benefit of all the students who are in our programs, so people can hear you.
While you're waiting for the mic, I just want to make one quick point. It's even broader. We're talking about the disintegration of trust in the media here, because that's what this is about. But I don't think you can take that out of the context of a diminution of trust across all public institutions in the post-Watergate, post-Vietnam era. And it applies to government institutions, media institutions, religious institutions, secularization. All of these are interwoven factors that I don't think you can take in isolation.
I think you make a lot of really good points. I just want to caution against romanticizing a period in our industry when the news was delivered always by white men.
Exactly. I'm not romanticizing it. I'm not romanticizing it. But I mean,
you're describing it as a high watermark in
a
our
high watermark for
session.
trust. But believe me, I don't romanticize that. I mean, I was a child, and it was bad that those were the only faces I could see, and to see other kinds of faces, I had to look at Sesame Street. You know, I couldn't get those faces from the evening news. I think you're right, and there should be different. I completely agree with you, so I didn't want to give that misimpression, and thank you for raising that.
And only because we talk about this all the time in our classes here.
Yes.
I'm really glad for having more women's voices and people of color weighing in, but there are challenges that come with that, obviously.
Well, as both of those things, I definitely agree.
We have time for one more question, and Man's being very patient back here in the back here.
Thank you very much. My name is Phil Long. I'm an adjunct here at Kent State. Getting back to Google and Facebook as a media, as a way to have your product disseminated. There has been a little bit of talk, and if it was to ever get some traction, and if the FCC was to put some regulation onto those types of channels, do you think that they would become more responsible in the way that they presented yours and others' people's information? Would they somehow be able to legitimize it, or to just bring it back up to a level of trust? Would their ethics change to that point, do you think?
Well, one of the things, let me just try, one of the things that we're talking about here in this FCC period is something called a fairness doctrine, which meant that all sides of an issue had to be discussed. So that's a starting point, so I'll let you all answer after that.
Well, the FCC is an independent regulatory agency that derives its authority from Congress. So the FCC can't regulate anything that Congress doesn't explicitly tell it can regulate. And I think there's an open question under the Radio Act and the Telecommunications Act, and I'm not a media lawyer, but just my understanding of the issue is that I'm not sure that there is an opening for the FCC to regulate here. As a matter of fact, there was an episode last year, I don't think this was fake news, but the FCC began a process of trying to go into local newsrooms and just sort of even ask the question, you know, are local newsrooms serving audiences as part of its sort of, broadly speaking, fairness doctrine sort of mission. And there was an uproar on the right that there was an attempt to censor local newsrooms. You have, this is a little far afield for your question, but in an area where the FCC does regulate television, local television stations, you have consolidation going on in which you have a particular chain of television stations, Sinclair, that is very aggressive in pushing national content with a certain ideological perspective on local television stations. That's something that the FCC can look at in terms of the market power of these stations, whether they're forming monopolies. With Google and Facebook, you do have, between the two of them, they're responsible for the vast majority of our click-through social traffic. But I'm just not sure whether the FCC even has the power to do that regulation.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the FCC needs to be needed. And so historically, when radio and broadcast TV came out, a sheriff was needed, because if everybody set up their own signal and just started broadcasting, then nobody could receive a clear show. And so the radio broadcasters and eventually the TV broadcasters needed the FCC to sort all of that out for them. And I'm not sure that Google needs the government to sort something out for them yet, but that might be a good way of thinking about it from the perspective of trying to find a way to make more regulation needed.
No, that's exactly it. That radio and television stations occupy a finite resource. There's only so much airwaves to go around. The internet is an infinite resource, and so the regulatory regime is completely different.
Yeah, and it's also probably worth highlighting that with the proliferation of cable channels, the broadcasters yelled foul, and now the FCC has basically abdicated any of its regulatory duties that it once had in any case. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you, panel, for your insights. Thank you, audience, for your questions.